Most systems do not fail because people are evil. They fail because the system slowly stops caring about the thing it was originally built to do. Schools start caring more about grades than learning. Companies care more about quarterly metrics than useful products. Social media platforms optimize engagement so aggressively that outrage begins outperforming truth. At first, these systems look successful. The numbers go up, performance improves. Everything appears efficient. But something underneath starts changing. The metric becomes emotionally and economically more important than reality itself. And once that happens, the system begins bending around the measurement instead of the purpose. This is why so many parts of modern life feel strangely fake. Not completely broken, just distorted. Like everyone is optimizing for something slightly disconnected from reality. If you've ever felt like effort and outcomes no longer match. If you've ever looked at modern culture and thought, this system rewards the wrong behavior, then you've already felt the effects of this. You just probably didn't have a name for it yet. You can see this pattern almost everywhere once you notice it. Students memorizing information only long enough to pass exams, employees attending meetings to appear productive instead of doing meaningful work, creators studying thumbnails more than ideas, people shaping their lives around what photographs well instead of what actually feels meaningful. At first, these behaviors seem isolated, small compromises, rational adaptations. But they are not random. They are reactions to incentives. The system rewards visible performance, so people optimize visible performance. And the more competitive the system becomes, the more aggressive the optimization gets. This is where things start to break, because the metric was never supposed to become the goal. It was only supposed to represent the goal. Grades were supposed to represent learning. Views were supposed to represent value. Productivity metrics were supposed to represent useful work. But eventually the representation replaces the reality, and people begin serving the metric instead of the thing behind it. There is a law behind this pattern, not a law in the legal sense, more like a structural tendency that appears whenever humans build systems around measurement. Economist Charles Goodhart described it in a single sentence. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Simple sentence. Massive consequences. Because modern society runs on measurement. Algorithms measure attention. Companies measure productivity. Governments measure economic growth. Schools measure performance. Even individuals now measure themselves constantly through followers, income, status, output, and optimization. At first, metrics are useful because reality is complicated. You cannot directly measure intelligence, creativity, trust, meaning, or value. So systems create proxies instead, numbers that approximately point towards something real. But the moment people are rewarded for hitting the number, behavior changes, quietly at first, then completely. The system starts producing behaviors that look successful from the outside while becoming increasingly disconnected from its original purpose. Take education. The original goal seems obvious: learning, curiosity, understanding. But learning is difficult to measure directly, so schools use grades as a proxy. At first, this works reasonably well. Students who understand the material usually score higher. The metric roughly reflects reality. But then pressure increases. University admissions depend on grades. Scholarships depend on grades. Status depends on grades. Suddenly, the measurement is no longer just feedback. It becomes survival. And once survival enters the system, optimization begins. Students stop asking, "Do I understand this?" They start asking, "Will this be on the test?" The difference matters. One question points toward knowledge. The other points toward performance. This is why education systems slowly drift toward memorization, standardized testing, and short-term information retention. Not because schools intentionally wanted shallow learning, but because the metric became too important. The more institutions optimize measurable performance, the less room remains for unmeasurable understanding. Social media accelerated this process into something far larger. Platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram are built entirely around measurable engagement. Clicks, watch time, shares, retention. None of these metrics are inherently bad. At first, they helped platforms identify content people genuinely enjoyed, but once creators understood the system, behavior adapted around the metrics themselves. This is where online culture began changing shape. YouTubers stopped simply making videos. They started engineering retention. TikTok creators stopped competing on insight. They competed on interruption. Instagram stopped being a place to share life. It became a place to optimize perception. The more measurable attention became, the more human behavior reorganized around capturing it. And algorithms reinforce the process, because algorithms do not understand truth, meaning, or quality. They understand signals. Emotional spikes generate stronger signals than nuance. Outrage generates stronger signals than balance. Extremes outperform subtlety because they are easier to measure. The system is not malfunctioning. It is doing exactly what it was trained to do. And over time, the platforms themselves begin evolving around these signals. This is why content online often feels increasingly exaggerated, repetitive, or emotionally manipulative. Not necessarily because creators became worse people, but because the environment selects for behaviors that perform well under measurement. MrBeast is one of the clearest examples of this process. Early YouTube rewarded relatively simple entertainment. Then, competition increased. Retention became more important. Click-through rates became more important. Audience attention became more expensive. So videos evolved into highly optimized attention machines, faster pacing, bigger reactions, more extreme concepts, more engineered curiosity. Again, this is not really about one creator. It is about system pressure. The more measurable success becomes, the more aggressive optimization becomes. Eventually, the platform starts rewarding the ability to manipulate attention itself. And once that happens, creators who refuse to optimize begin disappearing from visibility entirely, not because they lack quality, but because quality alone is no longer enough inside a system, driven by measurable engagement. The same pattern appears inside companies, especially large ones. At first, metrics are introduced to improve accountability. Management wants a way to measure performance, efficiency, growth, customer satisfaction, reasonable goal. But once promotions, budgets, and survival depend on those metrics, behavior changes around them. Customer support teams measured by tickets closed begin rushing conversations instead of solving problems. Sales teams measured by monthly targets begin prioritizing short-term deals over long-term relationships. Employees measured by visible activity begin optimizing appearance instead of usefulness. This is why so many corporate environments feel strangely performative. Everyone is busy, calendars are full, dashboards look impressive. But underneath the surface, people quietly sense that much of the activity no longer connects to real value creation. The organization starts feeding the metric system instead of the mission itself. And because everyone inside the system is responding rationally to incentives, the distortion becomes self-reinforcing. Nobody has to intentionally sabotage the company. The incentives do it automatically. One of the most famous examples happened at Wells Fargo. Management heavily pushed employees to hit aggressive account opening targets. On paper, the metric looked excellent. More accounts meant more growth. More growth meant a healthier business. But once the targets became tied to employee survival, behavior adapted. Employees started creating fake accounts for customers without permission simply to hit the numbers. Millions of them. The terrifying part is not just the fraud itself, it is how predictable the outcome was. The system rewarded account creation above all else. So eventually the organization produced account creation detached from actual customer value. The metric became the reality. This is what Goodhart's law looks like at scale. Not dramatic collapse at first. Distortion. Quiet, rational distortion spreading through the structure until the original purpose becomes secondary to the measurement. And by the time leadership notices the problem, the behavior is already embedded inside the culture itself. You can even see traces of this in industries where failure has massive consequences. Boeing spent decades building a reputation around engineering excellence and safety. That reputation was the company's identity. But over time, pressure from cost efficiency, deadlines, shareholder expectations, and competitive metrics intensified. Financial performance became increasingly central to decision-making. Again, the issue was not that safety suddenly stopped mattering. It was subtler than that. Priorities slowly shifted under optimization pressure. The more organizations are evaluated through measurable financial outcomes, the harder it becomes for slower, less measurable values to survive. Things like caution, engineering culture, long-term resilience. These qualities are difficult to track on quarterly reports, so systems naturally drift toward what can be measured clearly and rewarded immediately. This is where Goodhart's law becomes dangerous, because systems can appear highly successful right before they become fragile. The metrics still look healthy, the dashboards still look green, but underneath, reality has already started separating from the numbers representing it. Eventually, people begin applying the same logic to themselves. This is probably the most uncomfortable version of the entire pattern. Modern self-improvement culture often looks healthy on the surface. Productivity tracking, habit systems, optimization, goal setting, performance measurement. At first, these tools can genuinely help people organize their lives. But over time, something subtle happens. The person starts serving the metric instead of the purpose behind it. Reading books becomes chasing book counts. Exercise becomes chasing aesthetics. Productivity becomes chasing output. Even rest becomes optimized performance recovery. The more measurable self-improvement becomes, the easier it is to lose contact with the original reason for doing it. Curiosity gets replaced by efficiency. Meaning gets replaced by optimization. And eventually people begin feeling exhausted despite technically performing well. Because human beings are not designed to experience themselves primarily as performance systems. But modern culture increasingly encourages exactly that. This is why so many people today feel trapped inside lives that look successful from the outside. Their metrics are improving. Income rises, followers increase, output grows. Their calendars become more efficient. Their routines become more optimized. But internally, something feels increasingly disconnected because metrics can measure performance. They cannot fully measure meaning. And once external measurement becomes psychologically dominant, people slowly stop trusting their own internal signals. They stop asking whether something feels real, valuable, or fulfilling. Instead, they ask whether it performs well inside the system surrounding them. This is where self-optimization quietly turns into self-alienation. Not because discipline is bad, not because ambition is wrong, but because measurable performance begins replacing direct human experience itself. The system does not need to force this onto people. Eventually, people start doing it voluntarily. They become managers of their own metrics, their own brand, their own optimization dashboard. And at that point, Goodhart's law is no longer just shaping institutions. It is shaping identity. Dating apps reveal this pattern in an unusually clear way. At first, the goal seems simple. Help people find compatible relationships. But compatibility is difficult to measure directly, so platforms rely on proxies, profile engagement, swipe rates, matches, response speed, visibility. Over time, users begin adapting to those signals. Photos become optimized for attention instead of authenticity. Conversations become optimized for immediate response instead of connection. People learn what performs well algorithmically and slowly shape themselves around it. The strange result is that systems designed to increase connection can sometimes produce more performative behavior instead. Not because individuals are fake, but because measurable attention changes behavior automatically. The more competitive the environment becomes, the more optimization pressure increases. And eventually people stop asking, does this represent who I actually am? They start asking, will this perform well? This is the same pattern repeating again. Different domain, same structure. The metric slowly absorbs the purpose it was originally meant to serve. The reason this happens everywhere is actually very simple. Reality is too complicated to measure directly. A company cannot perfectly measure value creation. A school cannot perfectly measure learning. A platform cannot perfectly measure meaning or truth. So every system creates simplified representations instead. Metrics, proxies, signals, models. At first, these approximations work reasonably well because people are not aggressively optimizing against them yet. But humans adapt faster than systems expect. The moment rewards become attached to a measurable signal, behavior reorganizes around maximizing that signal. This is why almost every sufficiently optimized system eventually becomes gameable. Not because humans are uniquely corrupt, but because adaptation is unavoidable. Water flows around obstacles. Humans flow around incentives. And the more pressure a system creates, the more distorted behavior becomes. This is where modern life starts feeling strange. Many systems are no longer interacting directly with reality. They are interacting with measurements of reality. And those are not the same thing. You can see the consequences everywhere once you start looking for them. News organizations optimizing outrage because outrage drives engagement. Universities optimizing rankings instead of education. Politicians optimizing polling metrics instead of governance. Social platforms optimizing attention instead of human well-being. Even individuals optimizing appearance instead of identity. At first, these distortions look unrelated, but they are connected by the same structural pattern. The measurement slowly becomes more important than the thing being measured. And once that inversion happens, systems begin drifting away from reality while still appearing functional on the surface. This is why modern environments often feel exhausting in a very specific way. People sense they are interacting with performance layers instead of authentic signals. Corporate language sounds artificial. Online personalities feel engineered. Public discourse becomes exaggerated. Everything starts carrying a faint feeling of optimization behind it, because increasingly, that is exactly what is happening. The dangerous part is that Goodhart's law does not announce itself dramatically. Systems rarely collapse immediately after metrics take over. At first, optimization actually improves performance. Numbers rise. Efficiency increases. Growth accelerates. This is why the process becomes so seductive. The metric appears to validate itself. But over time, the gap between the representation and the underlying reality keeps widening, quietly. The system becomes better and better at producing signals that look successful, while becoming worse at the thing those signals originally represented. This is where fragility begins accumulating underneath apparent success. Not because the system stopped optimizing, but because it optimized too narrowly for measurable outcomes. The more aggressively a system pursues the metric, the more blind it becomes to everything the metric cannot capture. And eventually the ignored parts of reality start pushing back. Burnout appears. Trust collapses. Quality declines. Cultures become hollow. Institutions lose legitimacy. The metric still says everything is fine, but reality no longer agrees. So the solution is not to reject metrics entirely. That would be impossible. Complex systems need measurement to function. The real challenge is remembering that metrics are tools, not reality itself. Views are not the same as value. Productivity is not the same as meaning. Grades are not the same as intelligence. Money is not the same as fulfillment. The moment a measurement becomes emotionally absolute, distortion begins. This is why healthy systems protect spaces that cannot be fully quantified. Curiosity, trust, craftsmanship, relationships, long-term thinking. These things are difficult to compress into clean metrics, which is exactly why they matter. Strong systems understand the limits of optimization. Weak systems become addicted to it, and individuals are not immune from the same trap. The more your life becomes organized entirely around measurable performance, the easier it becomes to lose contact with the parts of yourself that cannot be measured cleanly at all. Once you understand Goodhart's law, modern life starts looking different. You begin noticing how often institutions optimize signals instead of substance, how often platforms reward reaction instead of depth, how often people confuse visibility with value. The pattern appears everywhere because the underlying logic is universal. Any system built around measurement will eventually experience pressure toward distortion. That does not mean optimization is evil. It means optimization has costs, especially when the metric becomes more important than the purpose behind it. Maybe that is why so much of modern life feels strangely disconnected despite constant progress. We built systems designed to maximize measurable success, and slowly, those systems began pulling human behavior toward what could be measured, even when the measurement itself was incomplete. The system is not necessarily broken. In many cases, it is functioning exactly as designed. That is what makes the pattern so difficult to notice and so difficult to escape.